So anyway, talking about some of the challenges of a reporter, even emotionally. So around midnight, well, I mean, I guess I have to explain also. Reporters then they start their day in the morning typically. Their schedule is quite flexible depending. Do they have a night meeting? Do they have interviews at night? So they get to adjust their schedule according to their reporting needs. But the editors, we want in wanting the latest news possible. Our deadline is around midnight, and for me, I because I wanted to take a 2 hour break so I could go to dinner with my family. I agreed to be the last editor out the door, and so I typically didn't get home till about 2 in the morning. Um, Whereas others probably got home. They still just the regular editors still probably didn't get home much before 1. That's just the norm in American journalism. And by the way, that means in a lot of newsrooms there are not very many married people because that's a hard life to live on a long-term basis. So I think I was trying to figure out one day when I was at the daily newspaper, there were 50 people in the newsroom, and I had as many children as all the rest of them put together, basically, and that was 4. So it was, like I say, it can be kind of a hard life anyway. But so around midnight, all the other reporters had left and gone home, and we have a radio going on where we are intercepting all the calls between police officers and fire stations and their um, their home base, who are giving them directions where to go. There's a fire and so all hands on deck to go fight the fire, or there's a car accident. We need officers at a certain place for the car accident. So that's what happened that night. As we heard over the radio that called a radar scanner. The scanner scans a number of frequencies and picks up wherever they start hearing noise, and it freezes there till that message ends. So we heard on this radio scanner that there had been an accident, that a car with 4 or 5 people had run off the road into the river that runs through our city, and they were calling out scuba divers to come out and rescue them. And so I grabbed my notepad and took off to this site, which wasn't too far from our newspaper. And when I got there, nobody was going into the water. There's this car sitting. It ran off the road, so it couldn't be far from the edge of the. They knew exactly where it went off. There's no reason to have thought it drifted too far, because the car's heavy, and the river right there, maybe no more than 20 feet deep, probably. I'm a good swimmer, and I thought, should I dive in and see if I can rescue somebody? And the more time passed, the more I felt like I should, because the scuba divers they'd called out, they did not get in there in 10 minutes. They did not get there in 15 minutes. They did not get there in 20 minutes. Ended up being more than a half an hour, or right around, I think a little more than a half an hour before the scuba divers showed up. I talked to a police officer. The police were there, and so they were in charge of the scene. And I said, hey, we should go in and try to rescue. They said, no, you can't do that. And their excuse was, if there's a broken window, if the windows are intact, then there's air inside the car, and there may still be people able to breathe inside the car. If you go in and open a door, break a window, or anything like that, then everybody else is going to die. Well, I still didn't feel good about it, especially as that time started ticking by. And ultimately, the scuba divers showed up, and they brought people out, and they all died. They were all dead. And I still wonder, would I disobey a police officer and dive in there to see? I don't have to open a door. I don't have to break a window. I can at least go see if the door's already open, if the window's already broken, then there's no harm in going in and trying to save somebody. And that's really probably the closest I came to something that weighed on me emotionally. I still wonder, should I have? All those people died, and I have an excuse. The police said don't do it. But sometimes police don't have the right answer either. So anyway, just from that small experience, I can imagine doing a story in typically a big city, not always, but typically in a big city where there's a mass shooting and maybe 15 or 20 kids have been killed or something like that, and how being on the scene and studying that and talking to the parents and their students could weigh on you and cause quite a bit of emotional stress. And that's what this one I was listening to today was about, was the stress that those sorts of stories can cause somebody. They have lots and lots of other topics. And so what I want to do is divide, and I'll put down the topic. Next week we'll pass the list. All right, actually I'll probably post it maybe this weekend. Post it on Moodle. So if you want to form a team and want to claim a topic, you can do that. I think I need to download all the audio, and so I may have to kind of do and maybe I will have you do a short presentation, but I also want you to do a video on it. A video kind of maybe not too different. You could even use the Screencast-O-Matic if you wanted to, because they don't give you any visuals, but I would like visuals added to this, and I'd like it turned into a video. So you probably start off then with a PowerPoint or whatever graphics you wanted to use. And part of this will be you can use, I would say, trying to think how much they would let us get away with. I would say that you can use up to 20% of their audio. I think most of these are about 1 hour long. So in other words, well, let's go 15 minutes. So it'll be basically 25% of the audio. Yeah, probably gonna go 15%. It's just gonna be our Moodle site anyway, so then they probably won't even know. But nonetheless, in case, well, it'll be, yeah, I'll put it on YouTube as part of this. If they object, then I take it down. YouTube notifies people when you use somebody else's audio. They notify them, and they decide whether or not they give you permission to use it or not. I usually try to do some sort of put on a slide when I'm going to use somebody. Like I use a lot of music from the Prague, I think it's called the Prague City Orchestra or something. And I put a slide about how to buy their music or whatever, and they always let me use their music that way. So I'll do something similar to IRE, so that hopefully they will not object to us using pieces of their audio. But like I say, we'll see. So that means you need to do some voiceover yourselves. So that's, again, whether you're using screencasting, you can, or do it some other way. You'll need to write your own script based on their what they said in their presentation. You can do some other quoting besides using their actual audio. You can quote them also, but it will be your script that you're writing, and it'll be shorter than their presentation. If their presentation is an hour long, I expect yours to be more like, in fact, that's probably why we need to actually shorten. So maybe no more than 10 minutes of their audio, because your presentation is going to be no more than 20 minutes. So even that's going to be half of your presentation if you want to use that much of their audio. But it would still only be a fairly small part of their presentation. So you add your script to it. You end up summarizing quite a bit because, like I say, they're going to talk for an hour. You're going to have maybe 10 minutes of their audio and then 10 minutes of your own summaries of what else they said. So anyway, I think you'll find it enlightening, and others who I'll decide whether we're going to actually have you do it, present it live in class, or whether you're just going to do the video and we'll just, in fact, I think I'll just have you do the video and we'll post that in Moodle. And now I may require people to listen to some, if not all of them, and include that as homework. So we'll do it that way. Okay, so we won't take the time in class unless there's something I think is really good that somebody's really prepared well. Maybe I'll make a special request, but not everybody will do it. So what I want to do is do this for 15 topics. So in here we have we have more than 50 people signed up for the class. So basically, you're talking 3 to 4 people on a team that can work on this project together. So it's not an individual project, but they're small enough teams that you obviously are needed to do a good share of the work. You can't be too lazy about it. So I will post in the next day or so the topics, and I'll start downloading. I downloaded the one today. I mean, they don't take a lot of time to download, so I just need to go through their library of topics and first off copy out their subjects and put those into a Word document and then post that. So they have some description of what it's about. So I'm going to do more than just the subject. I'm going to go ahead and pull out of it the title, the speakers, and they have like 1 paragraph description of what they're talking about. So and then I'll immediately download all of them as soon as I can. So since we're not going to present in class, we'll put a deadline on it. But let's go ahead and we'll decide that next week when we think you can get this project done. I need to do my part first. I need to get all that stuff downloaded and give you access to that stuff. I'll need to upload all of the audio, either upload the full audio to our Moodle site. Probably I won't. I'll probably just put it on an external hard drive and let you take it from me and copy it from my hard drive to your computer. Yeah, we'll do it that way. Okay, any questions on that? So we're probably looking at finishing that project maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks down the road, something like that. Give you a little bit of time to work on that. But then we have to come up with 2 more projects, I think. So that's so I'm going to count that, I think, also as 15%. And then that gives us 10% for another project and 10% for another project. And I think these ones I'm going to let you, one of these I'm going to have you write a subject journalistically. And one of these we're going to have you write academically, and you take the file, and we'll talk about AP style a little bit, and we'll study more about it. But just make it as part of the homework so those that already feel comfortable with it don't have to waste their time to bother to talk about it. If there's questions about it, I had a number of I've taught courses where we had to write an APA, and so I found a number of good sources on that, and I'll post those on Moodle when that time comes, so you can practice your APA writing as well. I don't have these decided yet, like what we're going to be writing, but I'll put APA as one and AP as the other. Will be one. we'll probably do news first and then APA the last project. So, any questions on that? Sorry, I don't have all the details. I'm still thinking it through what I want you to do. But okay. Your homework for next week, I'll tell you right now. I've uploaded to Moodle chapters 1 and 2 of a book that some of you used somewhat in my history of media course, but you weren't required to read anything except the presentation you made. So there might be somebody in this that did a presentation on this, but still didn't go into a lot of detail. Chapter 2 is a good review, I find, for mass communication theory. And so I want you to read that this week. It's not short. There's probably at least 30 pages to it. But that's your only assignment is read that one chapter. So it may take you a while to complete that. But if you feel comfortable with the theory, then you may be skimming some of it. That's up to you. But there will be a quiz on that next week. So I want you to review the basic, some of the most basic theories of mass communication, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about some of them today, and we'll talk about some of them next week. So we'll also review them in class, and then again, the quiz will be at the end of class, and as there will be a quiz at the end of today's class. So, by the way, did everybody sign up for Moodle? Is everybody ready to take a quiz today? Hopefully you signed up. If you have any questions, if you haven't, the key, we went through that. The key was journalism 2019. Was that what it was? Anybody remember what the key is to our? So if you haven't signed up, you can sign up now while we're talking. You were given some assignments for this last week to some videos to watch. There was one that, by the former Newsday executive editor. I hope you had a chance to watch that. It's a very good video. A lot of the videos I'm going to show you, I don't necessarily agree with everything that's said in them. For example, the editor defends he defends the mainstream media as being unbiased, and I would say now more than ever, it obviously is not. And I can show you some statistics that would demonstrate that it's not unbiased. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. Anything in that video that jumped out at you that maybe surprised you, or maybe just was just very interesting to you? Anything in that video that you found particularly interesting or surprising? Anybody? This class is a lot less boring if people will discuss things. Otherwise, I have to talk and talk and talk, and I know you don't want me to do that. So, what do you think? Anything in that video by the Newsday executive editor? Again, I certainly admire. He's won as an editor, won lots of Pulitzer Prizes, the top prize in American journalism. He's certainly knowledgeable. Anything in it? Again, one more time. One of the things he noted in there is that it's becoming more difficult to figure out what is news. What do you mean by that? Why is it more difficult today to figure out what is news? In your own opinion, no matter what he said. Yeah. One thing he said, a lot of opinion going around for sure. He actually faults the fact that there are not as many gatekeepers. That's one thing he said is there are not as many gatekeepers. And why aren't there as many gatekeepers? You know why there's no longer as many gatekeepers? Proportionally, there's not a lot of gatekeepers because, and what is a gatekeeper? In journalism, what do we mean by gatekeeper? It relates to one of our theories, right? So what is a gatekeeper? Who is a gatekeeper? Who is a gatekeeper? I was part of my job was to be the wire editor, which meant every day probably about 1,000 newspapers came through my computer, and some days we only had enough room to run 12 of them, 15 of them maybe. And so who decided which 15 stories to run in the newspaper? I did. And the other 985 or whatever didn't make it. So I was a gatekeeper and kept the public from reading 985 stories. Um, there are other gatekeepers as well, but editors are the primary gatekeepers in a newspaper, and they're the equivalent in broadcast journalism. There aren't as many now in two sense. There are not as many. One is, in one sense, there aren't as many because there are so many citizen journalists, so many people that are proclaiming to be part of the news media online, and they have no editor in many cases. There is no gatekeeper to them. Bloggers, for example, but they may not call themselves bloggers, but they are in essence bloggers. They have their own website. They're putting up not just in some cases text, but some cases multimedia blogs and so forth, multimedia stories that they've written. Some cases they do original reporting, some cases they don't. It's hard to know always, in some cases when they've done it originally, when they haven't done it originally, when they're just using information they gleaned from somebody else, from some other reporter. But in many cases they have no reporter. There's a top investigative reporter that has her own website, SarahACarter.com. As far as I know, she has no editor. She just posts her own stuff. So there are fewer gatekeepers in the sense that there are many more media, and not all those media have any editors. At the same time, the American newspapers have lost 2/3 of their advertising. If you lose 2/3 of your advertising, what are you going to do? Well, one of the most expensive things in your budget is people. And so you have no choice but to start laying people off. And so there have been tens of thousands of American journalists laid off from their jobs. Editors are typically some of the last ones. Photographers have been some of the first ones. And so a lot of reporters are starting to do their own photography because there are no professional photographers to back them up. To a newspaper is a fairly easy cut. It hurts their newspaper, but they do it anyway because they're just setting up their priority. Where do we cut? Photographers go first. Reporters start going next. And the last ones to go out the door are the editors. And in fact, they're going to be reluctant to lay off the editors because at least they might have higher tier. Like it might have even been that this journalist, the editor of Newsday, was kind of pushed out the door. There's a reporter I mentioned, or an editor, the executive editor of the Washington Post. I think I talked about him last week. Suddenly, when their economics started going down, he was suddenly made, what do they call it? They left him a title, but took away his salary. So anyway, even top reporters, I have on my own Moodle site, my personal Moodle site, an interview with a Pulitzer Prize winner from the Oregonian, based in Portland, Oregon, near where I live. He was pushed out the door. Even with the Pulitzer Prize, a few years later, sorry, you're too big budget. You're out of here. So they're losing a lot of people. In some cases, they finally do get the editors. But what I started to say is the editors, even if you lose all your reporters, you still need editors to work the wire. So wire editors like myself, you still need to fill the pages. And so it may not be with local news. It may be with wire news from Associated Press or the New York Times, Washington Post. They all offer wire services. And so you're looking at their wire stories to fill your news hole because your reporter, you don't have enough reporters anymore. So, you can always fill it that way. You don't want to. And so, you hesitate laying off any of your reporters, but the newspaper I was at is now probably averages about 1/3 the size. When they lost 2/3 their advertising, they're now the size of the paper is about 1/3 the size of when I was there. And so they don't have as much room for news stories anyway. So as they lose, because the news story, you need to, from the economic sense, you need to have, you find a balance into how much advertising and how much news you put into a newspaper to be profitable. And so they might have raised the advertising a little bit. That first newspaper I worked at in Tampa, Florida, they had a higher percentage of advertising because they gave the newspaper free. And so they had to pay for it somehow. So they had a higher percentage of advertising in that paper. And so probably a lot of the newspapers now, that even if they're not free, they might be raising that percentage of advertising up a little bit to help pay their bills. I mentioned last week, I showed you some native advertising, I believe, that I created. Native advertising is made to look like real content, real news stories. And it was extremely effective when I created that native advertising approach to promoting a politician. Most newspapers, most high quality newspapers resisted that. They said, oh, that's blurring the line between news and advertising. And we're clearly in native advertising, you're trying to kind of fool people into thinking this is news. And that's indeed what I was doing. Yeah, for sure. And so for years they condemned that, but not now. New York Times sells native advertising. The Washington Post sells native advertising. The Wall Street Journal sells native advertising because they need the money. And if their competitors are selling native advertising, they have to do it too. So it's, anyway, bottom line is when you start cutting budget, you start cutting people in the news business. And so there are not as many gatekeepers anymore. So he's right about that. Now, gatekeepers can be positive and negative. They can have both a positive effect and negative effect. If they're biased, basically everybody's biased. Everybody is biased. So I undoubtedly made my selection. Now, some days we had a lot more than 15 news wire stories in the paper, but I'm just saying some days we had a small paper, therefore we had relatively few wire stories. Other days we had a big paper. Then in those days, that was before all the advertising, before everything started changing. So we had a lot more wire stories, but nonetheless, regardless whether it's few or many, I was the gatekeeper. And I'm one of the few conservative journalists in America relatively. And so I was probably choosing some stories that had more of a conservative angle to them, that were framed a little more conservatively because of my biases. Now, usually it's the other way around. Most wire editors and most editors are liberal in America by American standards. And that, again, differs from what is a conservative and what is a liberal, changes from country to country, culture to culture. I think I mentioned last week, in America, I'm conservative. In Kazakhstan, I'm a liberal. In Malaysia, I'm probably more liberal than conservative because it relates to my feelings about free press and so forth. And in countries like Kazakhstan, they inhibit the free press, inhibit free speech, inhibit freedom of religion, and so that makes me a liberal because I'm in favor of free speech, free religion, free whatever, free. Um, okay, so he also I talked a little bit about him last week. I'm not sure how much more I want to go into it, but he did talk about some ways to identify real news. You might remember he showed a video of of a battle in Iraq, and his question was, "Is this news?" And it kind of caught. I mean, the viewers in that room with him were caught off guard a little bit, and so it was kind of unfair to them. But he ultimately decided, no, this wasn't news, and it was based on the very first thing they saw, but people weren't really looking at, and that was the website. The website was not a news website. The website was owned by the United States government. The United States government provides information, but that is not news. That's up to journalists to decide how to handle that information, and whether the information is even true. There have been lots of times when the U.S. government has lied about stuff, and every government lies about stuff. And so only journalists are in a position to try. I don't know, maybe not only, that may be too strong a word, but anyway, journalists have to try to figure out if they're good, ethical journalists working in a system that allows them to do it. Anyway, try to figure out, propaganda put out by a government and news put out by a government, or news information, and then they themselves, ultimately they should check on it. They should check with other sources and decide, is this real? Is the government trying to jerk us around, and so forth? And that's challenging, and obviously in some countries more challenging than in other countries. On that subject, on this subject, really, when I first got to Kazakhstan was when Russia invaded Georgia. It was almost like just a month or so into my presence there, and I was teaching a class on media and society, and I challenged the students to try to think about. Well, first off, I asked them which side they think was right. Was Russia within its rights to attack Georgia? And take over some of Georgia and so forth. And they all thought Russia was within its rights. Their national news, international news, all comes from Russia. And so even though it's an independent country, they don't have a real strong news medium or news media, and so they get most of theirs from Russia. And so I said, well, how do you know it's true? And they told us it was true, sort of thing. And so I suggested, I challenged them, have you listened to BBC, for example, or any of the Western news media? And how do you know they're not right? And they started kind of fighting with me over this, not physically, but they were appalled that I would suggest that their news media was biased. And so I said, well, who controls the news media in the West, and who controls the media in Russia? And so they go back to who. That's a serious question. That's one of the main questions that the Newsday editor poses in identifying real news. is who controls it, and also identifying the quality of that news. Is the source independent? Can it write about any, can it write freely about whatever it wants to write about? If it can't, then that's not real news. Um, but like I said, the students in Kazakhstan at first really wanted to fight over that. The news from Russia is controlled by the Russian government. So you don't write anything uh, as a Russian journalist that is going to make Putin mad. You're going to lose your job, if not your head. But then they said, well, American media is biased too. And they're absolutely right. But there's a difference between being biased and being controlled. And so I pointed out to them that American media is extremely biased in a way that I don't like, actually, because it is controlled by liberals, and I'm a conservative. And I think they misreport a lot of things. And in fact, I didn't like the way they were reporting on George Bush at the time. He was president. I thought they were out to make him look bad in every way they could, and they were changing the narrative. For example, they were accusing, acting like it was absolutely true that George Bush agreed to invade Iraq because he would make his oil stock more valuable or something. Whereas almost everybody in Congress supported it, including all the Democrats, including Hillary Clinton, including Bill Clinton wasn't in Congress, but Bill Clinton supported it. Because they got their information from the CIA. It was a CIA failure that caused them to invade Iraq if indeed there were no weapons of mass destruction. That's another issue. There were news stories from a general in the Iraq army that they had sent their weapons of mass destruction to Syria. So who's using weapons of mass destruction now? Well, the Syrians. So there's still that question. I don't know for sure whether there were any there or not, but Saddam Hussein wasn't allowing inspectors to come check. But anyway, I thought they were being very hypocritical in that the Democrats all supported the invasion too, and they wanted to put it all on President Bush's shoulders. So I didn't like the way that the American press was treating him. But my point in this case was exactly that. How do you know that American press is free? Because they can do anything they want to the president. They can say anything they want to about him. They can misreport him. They can make him sound stupid. They can accuse him of stuff that I think is illogical and unfair. And he can't do a thing about it. And if there's ever more evidence that now it's even worse than then they gave George Bush a lot of negative press, but now it's like 90% anti-Trump. It is the biggest attack on any president has ever lived. So that's the difference. The difference is whether or not somebody's telling you what you can write and what you can't write, and who is that person or who is that entity. Now, there are some, we'll talk about it later today, probably, well, corporations have that power. From my experience, though, very seldom do corporations wield that power. But if you watch the other video by the award-winning broadcast journalist, Sharyl Attkisson, she had also won all sorts of prizes for her reporting. She was working for liberal media for 20 years. And she said it was basically about the time that Obama became president that everything changed for some reason. That suddenly the corporations were telling them what they could run and what they couldn't run. And so she finally quit CBS TV, which is one of the mainstream liberal media. She just quit because they were telling her what she could report on. And it had not happened until I think she quit about somewhere around midway through Obama's term. Not to say that Obama was telling CBS what to do, but somehow the corporation decided that anything that was anti-Obama was not going to run in their TV, in their national news feed. I don't know exactly why, but things changed, according to her, rather dramatically right about that time. And so most of her critique, if you watched her videos, I think I had you watch two of them. um, talked about, just bad reporting where one of the journalists agreed to write a friendly piece for the CIA, um, and even agreed to let them read the story before they went into the paper. Well, that's not journalism. It may be called journalism in some countries, but that's not free journalism, and not journalism according to journalism ethics in America. Is that one of the worst things you can do is let a source um, tell you what you're going to write about them. I mean, that then just makes it propaganda. So journalists don't turn into propagandists if they let their sources tell them what to write, whether it's government or anybody else, movie star, whatever. If you're letting your source tell you what to write, then you're a propagandist. Um, so anyway, so you hopefully watched her video as well, and she's talking about some of the examples that she's seen over the last few years, where journalists have sold their souls in a sense, have stopped being journalists and have become propagandists. Um, this guy runs the Media Research Center. He also has a news website. It is mostly takes news from other places. They do some original reporting, but not a lot of their own. So he mainly just pulling stories from other media. And he's the one that's been tracking how much negative news, for example, that Trump's been getting, and it's right around 90% negative, which is unheard of. Um, the press has never gone after another president like that before. Um, it has been biased for decades, and that's provable. That's why I kind of laugh at the Newsday editor for saying it's not true. Prove it. He challenged his students to prove it. Well, students don't know enough to prove it. I can prove it. I'd love to take him on that one, because it's clearly biased in many different ways. And we'll talk a little more about that today. But anyway, that's the main thing that he's talking about, some of the specific things like what you're able as a professional journalist to say about a president or somebody or a president's family and not get fired. And it's totally depends on whether the president's Republican or Democrat. Absolutely. If they said some things about Chelsea Clinton, for example, not a president's daughter, but a highly recognized person, like they've said about some of the children of Trump, journalists would have been fired even by a conservative medium. You just don't say those things, but they said them about Trump's kids, and they say stuff about Trump all the time they would never allow to be said about one of their favored people. I want to run a few of these videos. I can't put them onto my video, so I'm going to stop my recording, and we'll go and the videos we'll watch are just short. Okay, so they mentioned in that video, some of the, that basically it's impossible for media not to be biased. And they are the ones that control what you see, whether they're an editor or the writer. And indeed, there are controls and problems with the message that we get at a lot of different locations. It could be from the government, whether it outright threatens or controls the media, or it simply lies to them. And that happens quite a bit. There was a case back during the Nixon era, so early in my career, then again made it kind of memorable, called the Pentagon Papers case. And some of you may have seen a movie about the Washington Post, and they're breaking the Pentagon paper, the scandal, I guess you could call it that. It was not something that led to Nixon's removal from office or from his resignation, because it's actually the Pentagon Papers showed that that the government had been lying to the people for years. And so it just documented some of the lies that it told, and some of them did happen during the Vietnam War. And Nixon did oversee the end of the Vietnam War. He's the one that actually ended the war. So one of the professors here on campus was teaching about American presidents, and I was assigned to review his final exam. And it said that Nixon was forced out of office because of the Vietnam War in part. And that's not true. Just simply not true. There was no real discussion of the Vietnam War when it came to his resignation. It was all about the Watergate scandal in which the Republicans spied on the Democrats, and then Nixon was part of the cover-up. And so that's kind of what they're trying to get Trump on now. That's their latest scheme to get rid of Trump. But that was why he left office. They finally pinned him down on enough evidence that it was obvious that he wasn't actually impeached, but it was obvious that Congress was going. The impeach in America, sometimes the word gets misused. To impeach the president only means that they're going to hold a trial and decide whether or not to kick him out of office. The House of Representatives is the one that impeaches. So it's currently, if they decide to impeach President Trump, it'll be a Democrat-controlled House that says that he has to go to trial. It'll be the Republican-controlled Senate that decides whether or not he's removed from office. So it's unlikely he'll be removed unless they find a lot more evidence of him doing something wrong than what they have now. They're mostly using it now just as a campaign tool to try to win the presidential election next year. So it's kind of a farce. It's not going to happen unless they really do find some really strong evidence against him, which at this point they don't have. They don't have it all. So it's a two-step process. The word impeach actually means kind of indict. In a criminal sense, you send somebody to the trial, so to speak. So the House of Representatives can send him to trial, but the jury is the Senate, and that's controlled by Republicans. So it's unlikely, at least unless the Democrats win control of the Senate, maybe they'll try to get him thrown out after he's reelected, probably. So anyway, so government can be involved. Going back to the Pentagon Papers, so a government employee, no, excuse me, it wasn't an employee. It was an employee of a nonprofit organization that had done some research on the subject, on the degree to which the government had kind of manipulated information for decades at that point. And so he released his information, which included classified, secret documents that it was illegal for him to give to anybody, to the New York Times and the Washington Post. And the movie that came out was about the difficulty of, first off, of getting confirmation and whether or not they really wanted to take on the government, what the government response would be. And indeed, the government basically threatened to close them down if they released those papers. And so the Supreme Court had an emergency session, and they decided no. Let me see. Let me back one step. The government, the executive branch of the government, the presidents, the executive branch, State Department, whoever, wanted to stop them from printing it, period. That was what they wanted to do. They wanted to stop them from printing it ahead of time. And the Supreme Court said, no, there's no such thing in America of prior censorship. They have the right to do it, and then you decide what to do after that. I don't think the Supreme Court actually said they could not be taken to trial themselves for releasing secret information, but the government, the president, decided it wasn't worth going after them at that point, and thought that the Supreme Court would probably side with them anyway. I don't know, but it didn't actually go that far. But the guy who gave them the information, that had the classified information and gave it to the media, did go to prison. I personally kind of object to that. I think because the government in America classifies lots of information just to keep from being embarrassed. And so there's a lot of stuff, for example, that happened under Obama, and even stuff that happened not because of President Trump, but under President Trump. One of the things one of the big issues in America right now is what's called deep state. You probably heard that. You may have any idea what deep state is when we're talking about that in America? When somebody gets a job with the government in America, they basically can't be fired. It's very, very hard to fire somebody once they get a job. And so there are, I guess you could say, four main entities in America that have been taken over by liberals and totally controlled by liberals. One is Hollywood. 90% of all the, I'll have a slide, I might be off a little bit, I'll jump to it in a few minutes. 90% of all the donations and stuff made out of Hollywood goes to Democrats and liberal causes. The second one is academia, universities. The average is at least 5-to-1 liberal professor to conservative in America, and a lot of those conservatives are in areas that aren't political, like science. Maybe they let them into economics, but in an area like journalism or political science, it's very rare to find a conservative professor. Whether it's by strategy or by whatever, it doesn't happen. The third one is journalism. Journalism by surveys, and so by self-confession, so to speak, there are 4 times as many liberals in journalism as there are conservatives. And I'd say it's probably worse than that, but because people get to identify themselves, I think liberals are smart enough now to say, oh, I'm a moderate, even if they're very liberal, because they don't want that. They realize it's giving them a bad name. So a lot of them, I think, are lying about what their real feelings are politically. And the other one is bureaucracy. So again, if you join the bureaucracy of America, you can almost not get fired, and that has become dominated strongly by liberals, Democrats, to the degree that, again, I think during the last election between Trump and Hillary, 90% of the donations from people who work in the government went to Hillary. And now during the presidency, they've become, they started leaking all sorts of stuff, trying to get President Trump in trouble, leaking the very most the slanted material they can find against him, and the New York Times and the Washington Post gladly print it, even though in many cases they found that's just not true. So you had a lot of the liberal media that during this Russian Gate thing that took more than 2 years to investigate. Ultimately, it was a team of Democrats that were investigating and trying to get Trump in trouble. There were people, almost all of them voted Democrat, or one of them, the guy that was really running it, had been scheduled to go celebrate at Hillary's victory party after the election, which obviously didn't turn out to be a victory party. And so he was the one heading up the investigation of President Trump. So if they could find anything, they would have gladly recommended that he be impeached. But ultimately, all the things that have been leaked out of the government, all the prejudicial stories that have been written by all the liberal media, turned out there was nothing there. These 15 liberals that had done this investigation trying to find something to charge the president with couldn't come up with anything. And so now they're looking for new things. And so it's just one thing after the other. So one of the important, so anyway, that the deep state refers to all these guys, all the people that are embedded into the government that think they can run the government and defy the president, whoever the president might be. But most likely they're going to try to defy him if he's a Republican, if he's a conservative, because they're liberal. And so the deep state refers to those people in the bureaucracy. Um, so this is a whole new issue. I didn't really believe in a deep state, or I didn't really think too much about it until Trump was elected. And now it's become so obvious. There's so many leaks and so many interactions between bureaucrats in the government and the media, false stories, biased stories that they end up not being true, that it's become extremely obvious that there is a deep state. Um, anyway, talk about that some other time maybe. But so government itself can put out false information, as I was just talking about. Members of the deep state were giving supposedly good information to the New York Times and Washington Post that suggested to all the liberal media that President Trump was going to be indicted after the Mueller report came out. And the Mueller report, he's the head of that group of Democrats that were going after the president. They came out with a report, and they couldn't find anything to impeach him with. And so all those reports that were leaked out of the bureaucracy were false. New York Times and Washington Post printed story after story after story that turned out not to be true, and they're not apologizing for them, which is another ethical question. If you're going to print stuff and it turns out to be false, by journalism ethics in America, you're supposed to basically correct it. But they would be correcting dozens of stories. Once the Mueller report came out, they would have been apologizing for dozens of stories that they wrote about Trump that turned out not to be true. So you do have, besides the government, you do have conglomerates, you do have corporations that apparently, according to Attkisson, are starting to wield more power, at least in the top national media in America. Whereas during my career, I didn't see a lot of it. I worked for one of the top newspaper chains, McClatchy, and I never saw them putting any pressure on us. I saw journalists sometimes perhaps biasing their own stories because of the community they lived in. So close to where I lived, there was a nuclear reservation that was involved in making nuclear materials for nuclear bombs before the end of the Cold War. And so, and the people who worked at the nuclear reservation made lots of money. And they made up maybe, I can't remember, 5 or 10% of all the workforce in that city, but they made almost half of the money that went through that economy. And so I would say that the reporters censored themselves sometimes, that they biased their own stories in favor of Hanford because they knew how important it was for the community. Would the editors have also forced them to either not write some stories or write others because of the community pressure? Maybe, and maybe they did somewhat. The editors did, but I had no sense that the corporation, the conglomerate that oversaw that owned the newspaper, put any pressure on them. They put pressure on themselves mostly. That was my perception of it anyway. I never felt any pressure on any of the work I did there. And that was a very liberal medium that was controlled by a big conglomerate. And so I disagreed with them on lots of things that I can come back to. But in fact, that's the next subject, I guess, in the gatekeeping. Control biases and biases of the editors. Agenda setting is a way of biasing the news, for sure. As part of my job, we had what we called a front page meeting. Every day we had a front page meeting around, 5:30, between 5 and 6 o'clock in the afternoon. They said we worked till midnight, so sometime around 5 or 6, we would have the front page meeting. The front page meeting gathered the wire editor, the editor in charge of the newsroom that day, the metro editor who was in charge of the local reporters, the feature editor sometime if she had something that she thought might be valuable to the front page, sports editor if he had something he thought they might want to put on the front page. That wasn't very often. Photographer, the photo editor would come in. Anyway, the executive editor and the managing editor would lead the meeting, and that decision, that meeting was to decide what do we put on the front page. And so everybody would bring in their best stories. I'd bring in a summary of the best stories that came over the wire. The metro editor would bring in a summary of the best stories being written by the local reporters. And then if anybody else had anything else, they would add that. The photo editor would come in and show us what photos he had that either went with the stories we had or might be standalone, where it's just a photo and a caption. Sometimes those would run on the front page. And then we had to make decisions. Well, there was I remember one case specifically because it kind of related to my brother. I mentioned my brother was a world-known agronomy. So somebody wrote a story that this family, the entire family, claimed to be contaminated and made sick by some pesticide spray about at least a mile away. And I asked my brother about it. I had to call him on the phone. He lived a couple thousand miles away from me, but I was just curious if he thought this was possible, that an airplane spraying an orchard, that you could have pesticide drift go a mile and make everybody in a family sick. I had my doubts about it, and my brother just laughed at the idea. He said, absolutely no way. No way that could possibly happen. He had done, that was his main thing, was testing pesticides and, seeing which, what sort of pesticides would be harmful to people, which ones were best used, to get the best crops. He came over in this area. I think he came to Malaysia and was as part of the United Nations and helped teach farmers how to get better crops, grow crops here. So he had been published more than just about anybody in his field during that time. And so here the editors were running the story that this family was sick being from this pesticide drift that my brother was laughing at. And so I raised the question, don't you think we should ask an expert? And I mentioned my brother, but he graduated from a university that actually had a branch campus in our community, and the main campus was like 100 miles away. And they had an extremely strong department of agronomy. And so it would be pretty easy to pick up a phone and talk to a professor or researcher from that university. And the editors refused to do it. To the contrary, they put it on the front page. So the extremely faulty story, trying to play up this environmental disaster, whatever they wanted to call it, and they never asked any experts, any doctors. They didn't interview a doctor. They didn't interview an expert like my brother. They didn't interview anybody to question the viability or the possibility that this story by this family could be true. So we had incidents like that where liberals tend to be strong environmentalists in America. That's part of one of their things. Not to say that conservatives don't care about the environment, but they try to look at it a little more rationally, I would say. So yeah, the editors their agenda setting can be extremely biased. And that's just one example that I recall, just because it kind of was very close to me. I grew up on a farm. I knew my brother was very smart. He had thousands of articles published on his research, and this just didn't seem right to me. And the newspaper wouldn't do anything about it. They wouldn't improve their reporting, and they put it right in the front page, blew it up. Wow, people are sick because of this pesticide and stuff. Anyway, so you get that sort of stuff. The editors write, they decide what's going to go on the front page, what's going to go on other pages. They decide whether to even run the story or whether to interview more people. They decide what the headline's going to say. The reporters don't write headlines. The editors typically, especially in daily newspapers in America, write the headlines. The editors have the power to rewrite an entire story if they want to. Some of the editors that I worked with, they would take a story and quite frequently totally rewrite a story. Then I thought that was kind of stupid myself because I happen to think our writers were good writers. And they're professional writers. We're paying them to be writers, and then this editor decided, oh, I don't like the way they write it, so I totally would rewrite people's stories. That is kind of egotistical to think that you are better than these other professionals in the same room. Controls and biases by the reporters themselves, absolutely. We'll talk about the framing, about theories of framing. How do you frame a story? How do you pose it? And we might have time to watch a video, again, actually by a liberal, but it kind of talks about the power of framing. And he talks about President Trump framing things in what he considers a false way or negative way. And so, like I say, I disagree with his example, but it's a good explanation of how people frame things and how they can control the narrative. And actually, I think that the liberal media in America controls the narrative in lots of ways by the way they frame stories. So I disagree with this scientist, but I agree with that it can be done and how it is done. Absolutely. So, there's a study that I'll refer to quickly in a few minutes about that where you get your sources at. And 18 of the top 20 media in America use more liberal sources than they do conservative sources on a regular basis. So if you choose to interview and base your story on more people on one side of the issue than the other side, you're automatically going to get a biased story. Once you have that information, so once you've done your interviews, then your framing comes into play, and you're most likely, if you've interviewed more people from one side of an issue than the other, you're probably going to frame your story based on something they said. We've talked, and some of you have been in classes where I've asked you to write a news story, and I've told you very specifically I wanted you to write a interview speech lead, which is a very popular type of lead, because if you've done a story based on interviews, then one of the easiest and best leads to write is one based on an interview. Well, if you have interviewed more liberals, conservatives, more people from one side of an issue than another side of the issue, you're also very likely to put in the lead an indirect quote from one of the sources that you've already biased in their selection. And indeed, very often, how they organize stories, which quotes they use, I remember a story written about our congressman from our area, and they were basically accusing him of some wrongdoing, and it was halfway through the story on the next page where they finally let him defend himself. And so basically people would have read most of the story, the first 8 paragraphs of a story saying that he was unethical about something before they ever gave him a chance to defend himself on page 2, which most people don't jump to page 2. So, very biased organization of the story. So that's up to the reporter, though. The reporter is the one that's biasing there. If it's going to be biased, and as I said, whether they're liberal or conservative, they're going to bias the story. But they can try to fight it. The standard when I was a young journalist was, yes, you're going to be biased, but at least be fair. Talk to people from both sides, give them a fair hearing, treat them fairly and truthfully, and on their side of the issue. That was the standard. Was probably more to be fair than to be objective. But functionally, that becomes the same thing if you truly are trying to be fair. So the reporters themselves can bias stories. And then, as I mentioned, the biases of the community and the readers. I mentioned the community where I worked at the daily newspaper. That was, right next to the nuclear reservation. That was bringing billions of dollars into the community. So, would the community want you to write a story that was negative about Hanford, about the nuclear site? The community wouldn't want you to. Whether you like it or not, the community believed that nuclear site was extremely important to their welfare, to their economy. And so this is where I said that I think the reporters could sense that. So the reporters they very reluctantly wrote anything negative about the nuclear site. And so in a sense, the readers themselves and the community itself, in a way, forced them to be biased. Because if not, they would be, people would be very upset with them. They would hear about it individually. Their friends, family members would probably yell at them. You're hurting our economy, all this sort of stuff. And so the community itself, the readers can greatly. And sometimes I've seen situations where just 3 or 4 vocal readers can upset an entire newspaper and make bad decisions, way beyond what they deserve. If you have, like say, 3 or 4 readers, you have 50,000 circulation. The editors sometimes, especially if they're really sensitive editors, if they don't have a fairly hard shell by then, if you have these people, yelling at you, whether it's in voice or, whether it's by mail or whatever, if you have people on your case about supposed bad journalism practices, their opinion can be blown out of proportion, let me put it that way. There's only 4 out of 50,000 readers, and they're getting the newspaper to respond to them in a way beyond what they probably deserve. And I've seen that happen quite a bit. Indeed, that's why I left the Tampa newspaper. I referred to leaving it after a couple of years, giving my boss a 3 months notice so he could find somebody to replace me. But the newspaper that we had, as I mentioned, was a free circulation. It was brand new when I got there, just a couple of months old when I got there. And I've already kind of referred to it, but how does a newspaper survive? What's it based on? How do they get their money? Yeah, advertising, especially if you give it away free, right? But even if you don't, if you charge for a subscription to a newspaper in America, the rule of thumb is you hope that it pays for its distribution. That's all you're hoping for, is that if people will pay for a subscription, pay $15 a month or whatever, that will pay for that 12-year-old delivering it. That'll pay for the trucks taking in the papers out to those news kids. It'll just pay for the delivery of that paper. That's all they're hoping for when they charge a subscription. And so if it's a free subscription, you're putting out a news rack, you're doing something. But if you're trying to go door to door like we were trying to do, it's very expensive. And there's no income from that. There was only income from advertising for our newspaper. So why does somebody advertise in a newspaper? Why would anybody buy an ad in a newspaper? Oh yeah, they want to make some money somehow, but what's it based on? What are they really buying when they advertise in a newspaper? They're buying the attention of the readers. That's what they're buying. And so how well a newspaper is read is vital. Just because we delivered 120,000 newspapers to the doorsteps or threw them in the driveways or whatever we were doing with those newspapers in Tampa, didn't mean 120,000 people read it. In fact, that was the stupidest thing that the president of that company did, was that when they first got started, they had already started a printing company, and so they were printing flyers and advertising circulars for the big grocery stores, for the big department stores. They already had that business, their business for printing their stuff. And so when they started the newspaper, the president told them, well, it wasn't 120,000. He said, we're going to put out door to door 70,000 newspapers from week one. We're going to put out 70,000 newspapers from week one. That wasn't true. And even if it wasn't, and I wasn't there yet, or I would have, I don't know, I was young, I was just out of college. I don't know if I would have confronted him or not. But I knew that was stupid. I already had a sense of the business sense. I knew that was stupid. Because, again, you're selling them people's attention, and advertisers are not idiots. They do not just throw their money around for the fun of it. And so once so first off, they did not put out 70,000 papers. And secondly, the readers had no habit of reading our newspaper yet. The readership is a habit. You decide which media you want to pay attention to. And if you're a brand new newspaper, you're probably not high on that list yet. And so him telling all these advertisers he was going to put out 70,000 and implying that 70,000 people or more, including their families, were going to read our newspaper from week one was the stupidest thing he could possibly do. Because it took just a few weeks before the advertisers realized they were not getting much readership. There was no response to their advertising. And so after that, it was extremely hard for them to ever win back any of those advertisers, ever, no matter how much readership we developed. Now, my job as an editor then was to get readership, get people's attention. And so I was writing the most interesting stories I could find, sometimes controversial. It wasn't yellow journalism, it wasn't false journalism, but I looked at everything I could find and say, what is going to get their attention? What will people read from our newspaper? What will get them to build a habit of reading our newspaper? And so sometimes it was controversial. So some friends of the general manager said, you shouldn't be so controversial. He had like 2 or 3 friends in this Lions Club, this service club. You shouldn't be so controversial. You need to scale that back and write stories about the local schools and stuff like that. And so when he told me that, I said, we're in Tampa, Florida. We're in an area of hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of schools. Which schools do you want us to write about? And that sort of story. How do we get readership by writing about schools and scouts and lion clubs and stuff like that? And we only have we were putting out like 24 broadsheet pages, so they're big pages, but only 24 pages a week. And those were filled up with about 2/3 advertising. So in reality, we had like 8 pages of content. Which schools are we going to cover that you think is going to attract people's attention if we write about schools and service clubs and stuff? And he said, well, that's what we're going to do. So I said, yeah, when I leave. So as soon as you get somebody, I'll leave. And that's when I bought my own newspaper. 3 months later, I happened to know the editor that they hired to replace me. We were classmates at the university. And so about 3 months later, my classmate said, we've lost all of our readership trying to do what these friends of the general manager wanted him to do. We've lost all of our readership. And so now we're going to become the most controversial newspaper. We're going to go way beyond what you were doing. We're going to become just as controversial as possible. We're going to go tabloid. We're going to come up with anything that we can get people's attention with, because you were absolutely right. We lost all of our readership. And so within a year, they had to sell the newspapers. So it's important to write in such a way, write good stories, write in such a way that you get people's attention. Otherwise, you don't have a product to sell, because your product to sell to advertisers is your reader's attention. That's what you've got. So Anyway, okay. Let's take about a 10-minute break and then we'll resume. So take 10. Um, and I mentioned from my own personal experience, I didn't really see a lot of corporate influence at the time during most of my career. I didn't see the corporations getting involved with their local news gathering and local editing and stuff, other than they would select their editor, their top editor at least, and that editor or the publisher, and maybe they might be involved in those two selections. But other than that, those people, their publisher and their editor, would choose people underneath them, um, and I didn't see any corporate involvement. I've read stories about some cases where, for example, a chain of papers decided they were going to with a daily newspaper once a week, somebody at the corporate headquarters was going to write the editorial, and they acted like that was a terrible infringement on free press. But yeah, I mean, the corporation does own it, and if they want to write one editorial a week, that is hardly excessive in my way of looking at it. If I own a newspaper, I get to write all the editorials if I want to. In this case, even though they're a corporation and I'm an individual, I see no problem with them writing one editorial a week. But it was written and framed in such a way as being a terrible infringement on free press, which I didn't see it as. There was John Pilger wrote a book, I think it's a documentary, a documentary about the invisible government. He even talks about how newspapers and media companies have actually started wars. And that's true. The media can be very powerful. They can start a war. Um, in fact, I think in that sense, I don't think the American media was without fault in the war in the Iraq War. The media itself jumped on board real early, and so did the Democrats, so did everybody else. So I don't, whether it's right or wrong, I personally thought it was not necessarily wrong war, but wrong strategy. I thought it's stupid to try to make one country had three very different ethnic groups in it. That was what I think their main problem was. They should have just divided into three countries, and probably it would have been fine. But whatever. Um, anyway, he is quite strong about the evil of corporations, and I'm not saying that has never been the case or is not possible, but I think it has over the years been over exaggerated by liberals. Um, he does, however, point out in 1983 there were 50 corporations that owned most of the global media, and most of the corporations were American. By 2002, about 20 years later, instead of 50, there were only 9 corporations. And at the time, now there's 5 or 6. There's 5 or 6 corporations, and even one of the owners of those 5 or 6 corporations, Rupert Murdoch, thinks he'll probably collapse down to about 3 mega conglomerates in the near future. And so, is that a good thing? No, obviously it isn't a good thing. Although even in the case of Rupert Murdoch, I've seen very little influence on the corporations he's purchased. Maybe trying to kind of send the general philosophy again, maybe the selection of a publisher or an editor, but day to day, I don't think he gets involved. But there's some influence. I'm not saying there's not some influence, but and there have historically been some very bad situations where corporations or newspapers have incited war and stuff like that. But right now, there are some counter conglomeration sort of efforts going on. There are smaller organizations that resist being bought up by conglomerates. There are public or government supported media, such as in America, the National Public Radio is supported by the government and the public broadcasting system, and those all have local affiliates with them. Now, frankly, the conservatives feel like those two are also too liberal, and they've questioned whether or not there's a need for the government to be supporting radio and broadcasting enterprises. And I think there is some good reason to question that, but regardless, they exist. There's advocacy media. A lot of big cities especially have weekly newspapers that advocate one certain thing, whether it's political or lifestyle. In the big cities in America, there are weekly newspapers supporting the gay and the gay community. There's alternative media like the Village Voice, although the Village Voice, sometimes it could be accused of being less than alternative media, but it's done a lot of good reporting. Some of the speakers I heard at one of the IRE conferences I went to were two of them were from the Village Voice, and I was very impressed with their work. Even though the Village Voice is known to be quite liberal, I was impressed with them as journalists. And there are still some independent media. But more than that, my counter argument at this time is new media. And we'll come back to that, but new media is killing the traditional media. And so traditional media, I'm not sure how many. I suspect in the next 10 years, there'll be hundreds of American newspapers going out of business. And so the conglomerates that own them are going to take a financial loss on them. So I think now with all the voices that are available on the internet, I see this as a much, I'm more worried about Facebook and Google than I am about most of the traditional media at this point, although they represent a different political perspective than I do, but so do the social media. And they're controlling a lot of what goes on worldwide. They're not just American. So, Facebook and Google have a lot of power. Facebook and what you can say on Facebook without being terminated, what you can, how they pile stuff up. There's been times where they've thrown all sorts of stuff in my stream that I think has been politically motivated. Google, there's a professor, I should probably find his video, a professor that Google is purposefully, and he's a Democrat, a strong liberal professor, but he says that Google is definitely trying to sway elections now, and that he's convinced that they can sway up to 15 million votes or even more, which would determine an election in America by how they do do their search engines searches. For example, the other day when the latest scandal is whether or not President Trump was within his rights to ask the president of the Ukraine to help in an investigation of a number of things. It wasn't just, it happened to include Joe Biden, who happens to be one of his opponents now in the presidential election, but it was the whole startup of the Russian scandal actually started in the Ukraine, or at least a lot of it was in the Ukraine. And part of the attack was on his campaign manager during the last presidential election was forced to resign because they got stuff out of the Ukraine that made his campaign manager look really bad, and it was apparent that they were going to come after him legally. So his campaign manager, in the middle of his campaign, had to resign. Well, that was again part of a deep state, or actually Hillary Clinton paid and the Democrats paid $9 million for for the Russian dossier against Trump, in which they just picked up a bunch of scandalous rumors from Russia, none of which anybody could ever prove. So none of them were ever proved. And that dossier also included some things about Ukraine. So President Trump was asking the president of the Ukraine, who happens to be a big fan of Trump. He was a former comedian, but he's the Ukrainian president was running on the same sort of platform that Trump was, which is kind of the drain the swamp, get rid of all the evil participants in the central government. He was running on that same platform basically. So, my point. What was the point I was getting to? So they're coming after him. So when I went on Google, what I wanted to know was, what did I put on there? Oh, the only words I put on there were Joe Biden, because the scandal related to Joe Biden is that his son took a job as a member of the board of directors of a corrupt company owned by a Russian oligarch in the Ukraine, and him and his partner were both being paid more than they were being paid somewhere approaching $1 million a year to sit on this board of directors of a company, a gas company, for which neither Biden's son nor this other guy had any experience. But it was so the supposition from the conservatives is that basically they were bribing Biden. And indeed, they have a video of Biden threatening, I guess, the president of the Ukraine if he did not fire a prosecutor that was investigating the company that his son was involved with. And he said basically, we've got $1 billion waiting here for you from the U.S. government. You will not get the $1 billion if you don't fire this guy that's investigating. He didn't say investigating my son, but investigating this guy who was investigating his son. So anyway, when I looked that up, and I just looked up Joe Biden, there were 3 links to liberal newspapers condemning Trump. There was no link to a conservative medium at all. And then there was on the side a big story of a profile of how wonderful Joe Biden was. So that's the sort of thing that Google can do, is you look up something and what are you going to see? Something favorable, something unfavorable. In that case, it was an example where everything that showed up in the top of the page, 3 links to liberal media condemning Trump and a big profile picture of a smiling Joe Biden saying how many years of wonderful service he'd given the United States. So that sort of influence is very powerful. And so there's a liberal professor, as I said, that says Google will probably try to change about 15 million votes in the next election. So that's way more than anything the Russians did last election, way more. Okay, some stuff that can quantify what I was saying about bias. The American people are not liberal. The Gallup survey showed that 40% of them called themselves conservative, 40% moderate, and only 20% called themselves liberal. That was an older survey, and I imagine it's changed somewhat. But still, the survey, or the people in America are consider themselves fairly conservative, or at least moderate. And it's also demonstrated by the presidential elections. If you go all the way back to the 1950s, Eisenhower was a Republican, Kennedy a Democrat. He died in office, obviously, so Johnson took his place, another Democrat. Then Nixon, Republican, won. Then Carter won for 1 term. Then Reagan won and held 2 terms, and Daddy Bush took over for 1 term. Then Bill Clinton came in for 2 terms. Then Baby Bush won 2 terms, and then Obama won 2 terms. So that's about as evenly spread as you could possibly have between the 2 parties. And yet, that is not reflected by what you see in the media. A survey by the American Society of Newspaper Editors found that 61% of the journalists identified as Democrats or liberal, and only 15% Republican or conservative. Another survey by Pew organization, which is liberal, not conservative, found that 34% identified as liberal, 54% as moderate, 7% as conservative. I think that moderate label is, like I say, people are trying to kind of save face by saying moderate, whether they're conservative, not wanting to be yelled at, not wanting to be fired, or liberals realizing that the liberal control of the media makes them look bad, so they would say moderate anyway. So, but the percentage is still the same, basically. That somewhere it's somewhere 4-1 or 5-1 liberal to conservative in their hiring practices. We see that reflected in the stories. There was a center called Center for Media and Public Affairs at George Mason University. George Mason's a liberal university controlled by liberals. And so you can go all the way back, but for example, in the with the John McCain Barack Obama election in 2008, McCain had 57% negative stories. Obama only 29%. So the conservative 57, the liberal 29%. As far as favorable, those were negative stories. Excuse me. McCain 57% negative, Obama 29% negative. Favorable stories, Obama got 36% favorable stories, and McCain only got 14% favorable stories. And this was assessed a content analysis done by a relatively liberal organization. And yet, by the way, besides this heavy pro-Obama news coverage, Obama had a online strategy that some of it may have been illegal, by the way. People from outside the United States are not supposed to be able to contribute to a campaign. And Obama's people solicited online, and that was before many people, that much was given online towards donation, towards political candidates. And so in that first election, they did not keep any IP addresses of any of their donors. So there's no way to prove what portion of $712 billion they got from outside the United States. But anyway, regardless, they ended up with, Obama had almost twice as much money as did McCain, and McCain would have set a record as the most money ever gathered for a political campaign in America. So McCain would have set a record, and Obama almost doubled how much money he had. That meant Obama had lots and lots of money to put into advertising, and yet he still only won by a small. He got 53% of the vote. Obama did. So you change 2% of the votes, and McCain would have been president, despite having half as much advertising, basically. So that's an indication, first off, that America is quite conservative to withstand this kind of barrage of what you could call propaganda. If it's that uneven in their coverage for one candidate to the other candidate, they almost certainly did sway at least 2% of the vote. But that's normal, by the way. So that's normal in America, and that's in the range of Republicans are used to that. That's in the range of acceptability of having twice as much bad coverage is in the range of acceptability in America, because the conservatives don't expect anything better from the media, and that's been that way for decades. The campaign before that in 2004 is almost identical. This was John Kerry versus President Bush, and Bush got 59% negative stories, and Kerry only got 25% negative stories. Kerry got 34% positive stories, and Bush only got 14% positive stories. In that case, Bush still won, even though the media did a hit job on him, basically. He won rather easily in that campaign. So, again, demonstrating the bias within the media in America And what it certainly, when Polgar and others suggest that the corporations would make newspapers more conservative, there's no evidence of that. Maybe in one story or two stories or something, they might find some example stories where a corporation forced one of their newspapers to be more conservative than they wanted to be. But this makes it very clear that the corporations are not controlling the journalists and making them very conservative, making their product very conservative. To the contrary, the journalists themselves are pretty much running the show. The a couple of professors, one from UCLA and one from the University of Missouri, did the study I already mentioned. They analyzed how many liberal sources the newspapers had in their stories, and how many conservative sources they had. And 18 of the 20 top media in America had routinely used more liberal sources than conservative sources, which would lead them to have more liberal stories, as was demonstrated in the prior research. In fact, ironically, this Wall Street Journal may be a good example of a corporation that tends to be conservative. Wall Street Journal is owned by Rupert Murdoch, who's seen as a conservative, and the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal is seen to be somewhat conservative. Nonetheless, when these researchers analyzed the news stories in the Wall Street Journal, they found the Wall Street Journal had the worst liberal to conservative ratio of sources of all the newspapers, of all the 20 media. Number one worst was Wall Street Journal. So that's a good example of where the corporation is conservative and they do not control the journalist. And so consequently, it actually has the most biased, by selection of sources. Wall Street Journal has the most biased reporting of all of the 20 top media in America. And this just shows some of the others in order. The only two that had more conservative sources were, as would be expected, Fox News and Washington Times are the only two large national media that are conservative. In Hollywood, I mentioned, and I think I misquoted the percentage, but the percentage is about 98% liberal in the political causes they support. The financial donations by Hollywood celebrities is 7-1. And of course, with their movies and stuff, they do routinely flood society with a lot of their liberal values. If you have ever seen a conspiracy movie where somebody's trying to take over the U.S. government, it's always a conservative trying to take over the U.S. government. It's never happened, but you can count on if Hollywood is going to make a movie about somebody taking over the government, it's always some conservative conspiracy. There's never a liberal conspiracy, not even a communist conspiracy. It's a conservative conspiracy trying to take over the government. Then I mentioned there was a survey of more than 1,600 faculty members in 183 universities. The percentage of liberal to conservative was 72% liberal, 15% conservative. By again, their self-description. So this isn't somebody's, not me saying this. This is how they describe themselves. 72% admitted that they were liberal, and only 15% admitted they were conservative. When they asked Democrat or Republican, it was 50% Democrat and 11% Republican. Many of the professors are more liberal than Democrats, and so they might not even identify with Democrats because they're socialists basically. Nowadays, the Democratic Party is getting liberal enough that they're probably welcoming themselves into the Democrat Party. I don't think we're going to take. We don't really have time. Well, maybe we will. You should have already watched some videos by Sharyl Attkisson, so I don't think I'll run a video here. Um, these are shorter videos. I thought I might throw in one just to uh, kind of explain what's going on a little bit from their perspective. Again, Sharyl was for 20 years a top investigative reporter for liberal media. First CNN and then CBS. And so she did well. She was very successful working in the liberal environment. But, then about 6 years ago or so, she just said, I've had enough. Her reporting was being censored or, um, blocked by her bosses at CBS. She could see a lot more bias within the reporting that was used, and she moved off. She has her own website and does her own independent reporting now. So going back to kind of the beginning, the question is, are news media reliable? Are they biased? If not, um, oops, I miswrote that. But anyway, and what could be done about it? Nothing, probably. Um, it's a battle of ideals. And if they want to, some of the things that Sharyl was talking about is how dishonest they've been in a lot of cases as far as actually giving, as we were talking about earlier, actually giving their, like Hillary's people the right to determine what questions that they would ask, or agreeing to call her speech muscular, all the stupid adjectives I've ever heard. Things like that are just they were being dictated to by a political candidate and very willing to do it. There was, I think, email was revealed where one of the newsmakers at, I think it's CBS, gave her all the questions that were going to be asked at a certain forum. So she had the questions, and her opponent, Trump, didn't have the questions. And that obviously is extremely unethical. I want to run this. I'll probably watch this, a couple of these next week. This guy is really, really liberal. In fact, this particular video that I clipped this photo out of is him basically saying what a moron Trump is or whatever. But in so doing, he is an expert in framing stuff. And actually, he's accusing Trump of framing things, of framing the national agenda, whereas I would say the liberal media are framing the discussion in America. But nonetheless, his explanation of what framing is very interesting. And so we'll go ahead and I'll put that slide into next week's, and we'll listen to him. Since I'm having you do all that reading this week, I'm not going to assign you any videos to watch. So again, if I were to say who really controls the media, certainly corporations have some influence. Certainly government has some influence in the West. I would say there's no question the journalists control the media in the West. And it's very apparent by the results. Where if you have 90% anti-Trump reporting, obviously somebody's writing those stories. So that's the journalists are controlling the media in the West. Very quickly, where do people get their news? This source is a little bit old. They're projecting a little bit into the future, but the latest data, well, I guess the latest data is 2024. You see a couple of years ago, or 1 year ago, about, 1 year before this. So around 2016, the online media overtook TV in the West. And of course, it's going to become even more powerful in the future. So where do online media get their stories? Does Google write its own stories? No. Twitter write its own stories? No. They all are pretty much piggybacking on the traditional media, which I'll raise the question now, but I raise it at the end too, is what happens when the traditional media goes broke? What happens when the newspapers start disappearing and the TV stations start disappearing? Who's going to write their stuff then? So there's serious questions, even as much as I despise, I guess you could say, the liberal control of the media in the West. I worry about what the world will be like when they're gone. Because then who does the investigative reporting? And so forth. You see the print has collapsed, so red is print. So fewer and fewer people are getting their news from the newspapers or magazines. This is by age group, and so the blue is the young generation under 24 and under. Again, this is a couple of years old. The red is up to 25 to 34. Then the tan or yellowish, whatever color that is, gold, is 45 to 54, and the green is over 55. So with online media, you see that online media strongly dominates among young people, not so much among the older people. With social media, not counting, so online is not online includes social media. Social media by itself, certainly younger people use more social media, and they use that as a source of news. I, by the way, use that as a source of news because I like all the media, liberal and conservative, and so I want them to post their latest stories on Facebook, and so I can follow what they're doing. So I follow the liberal and the conservative media through Facebook by liking them and then clicking into their stories. So I get a lot of my news from Facebook. I don't think it's necessarily bad. It depends on whether you're going to reliable sources or not and how you use it. Then that does make a difference. Print media, you see the younger generation, hardly any of them get any news from the newspapers anymore, from print. And even the green, even the old fogies like me, it's down to 15% getting their news, who get much news at all from the newspapers anymore. And then TV is still quite strong among the older generation, but look where it's at with the younger generation. So in some cases, the traditional media they're just surviving on the older generation. As the older generation dies, they're going to die too. The younger generation is not following traditional media, such as TV, even TV. As you see, they're 54% of the older generation is watching TV. 49% of the 9% of the younger generation. So the traditional media it's just a question of when they're going to die. And I think that's probably, it may not, I don't know. It may not be true in a society like in China. I don't know how if they will prop up their traditional media. But in the free market media, I think it'll be universal. And I gave a speech at one of the largest, I think the largest private university in India. And one of the students challenged me on suggesting that their newspapers would go out of business because they're right now really strong still. And I just said, yeah, it's going to happen. You're going to follow the trend. Right now, a lot of you people can't afford a mobile device, perhaps, or they're not used to using it, but they're going to get used to it, and it's going to become cheaper. It's that things will change to where they will go to their mobile devices for their news. It's just going to happen. How long it takes, what their local internet providers and local providers need to do to get them to move from printed media to online media, so forth. I don't know what they're going to have to do. I don't know when it'll happen. I just very positive it's going to happen eventually. It's going to happen. This is the average number of online news sources used by social media users and those who are not. So those who do not use social media have about less than 2 news sources that they use, online news sources, where those who are on social media use closer to 3 news sources on a regular basis. And same, those that use online search access less online news, and those that do use online search use more. Not real surprising. Trust in news by political orientation. You see that conservatives have the least trust for the media, and from the evidence I've provided, I think you'd agree they have reason to not trust it. The left has the most trust, but even then, it's almost 40% don't trust it. Or excuse me, 40%, yeah, 40% don't trust in media. Well, 40% do trust the media. Well, that's interesting if that's true. Trust in media. If they're saying it is trust, the conservatives trust it more, that is interesting, since the media are controlled by liberals. But maybe it's because they are still, the older people are still using newspapers as their primary source, as TV as a primary source, and the younger generation is not. That's just the opposite of what you would think it would be. Casual users versus heavy users. I don't think we need to see that one. Meanwhile, what's happening in traditional media? Around 2005 is when the tipping point hit the newspapers. And so you can see this up here. In green is newspaper, the value of newspaper print ads. In black is newspaper digital ads. And in gray is Google revenue. Back in 2005, Google hardly was hardly anywhere. 2006, more, until now the newspaper's revenue by 2014 had dropped from a high of almost 48 million. 48, that's probably billion. Where does it say? Billions, yes, in billions. So 48 billion in all American newspapers, and now it's down to 16 billion, so about 1/3 as of 2014. It's been going down from there. Whereas Google, shot up to 60 billion as of 2004, and we saw just the beginning there earlier on. So you see what's happening? Okay, I need to quit now, so we'll stop there. So that's the future of traditional media. So, and the question I asked was, what will happen? What will happen when the traditional media go broke? So your quiz is now available. You have 10 minutes to answer it, even though there's 15 minutes before it turns off altogether. So you don't, if we're a minute late, it doesn't really matter. You have 10 minutes to answer the questions. There's only 7 questions based on the videos I assigned you primarily. And we did some discussion already that talked about some of those things.